Merry Christmas. Not quite, almost, right? What are we, December 12th, I think, is today. So 13 shopping days until, the big guy comes down the chimney. So obviously not woodworking, but I'll divert a little bit here. In my family, and I think it's because of the Czechoslovakian heritage, Christmas is not the day, Christmas Eve is the day. So that means there are, math in my head, 12 shopping days until Christmas. Thankfully, all my shopping is done. So how's everybody doing today? As always, a huge thank you to Tight Pond for making this happen. And I'm going to take a minute or two and talk about the future. So you want to be here January 9th. The reason being, I'm going to have a guest on. And the guest is going to be Kristen Brown from Toto Boat. Paul and I, the folks, Paul helps me answer all the questions for WWGOA. We still get a lot of questions about epoxy. So when I had the opportunity to get Kristen from Toto Boat on one of our live streams, I'm going to do it. Epoxy is expensive stuff. Kristen is quite the expert. She's been with Toto Boat for a long time. So mark your calendar. We're going to make this an epoxy special on January 9th. You definitely want to tune in for that. I think there's going to be a giveaway of some kind. So you're going to want to queue up to get your name in the giveaway bucket. So in any case, watch your email, January 9th. Kristen is going to be remote, but she'll be available to answer your epoxy questions. I am going to try to answer your woodworking questions starting now. So Michael asks, running an end grain cutting board through a planer, yes, no, sometimes, or never? What a great phrasing of the question. For me, it's never. And this is one of these things, if you bounce around on the internet and you ask, 30 different woodworkers, you're probably going to get 15 different answers at least. So here's the deal. Let me grab a cutting board. This is an end grain cutting board. Switch your cameras here. And normally, but we can put our cutting boards as a rule into two categories: long grain, meaning the grain is running this way, end grain, meaning the grain is running this way. And the reason that we don't want to put end grain stuff through is that the end grain can often catch the knife. So rather than simply planing and smoothing the surface, the knife can catch. If it catches badly enough, big chunks of stuff can come flying out of your planer. And I think the reason that this is controversial, if you want to call it that, is that woodworkers do this and they manage to get away with it. It's one of these things that if it goes badly once, it could go really, really badly. Planer knives, planer heads are operating at a really, really high RPM. And if they have the opportunity to turn a piece of that into a bullet, it's going to come out of the infeed side at a really high rate, and it's going to hit you or fly across the room at a really high speed. So for me, that answer is never. If we take it one step further and say, well, then how do you deal with that? You should look at, we have on the site, this whole cutting board extravaganza. Remember, like a year ago now, we did a big cutting board thing. So it was myself, Shar, Alicia Albertson, Paul Mayer. One of the things we did with that, in addition to showing off individual cutting boards we had made, is I put together a bunch of cutting board how-to. And one of the things I show is how to make a sled that you can use a router to level an end grain board specifically, but you could use it for any cutting board. So even if you're just gluing something up that's larger than your planer, that leveling device is useful. So if you search the site for that cutting board content, You'll find the shop-made jig that lets you level stuff, and leveling an end grain cutting board with a router bit is a much safer way to go than putting it through a planer. So for me, the answer is never. Chuck asked, do you have a recommendation for a miter gauge upgrade for a table saw? Well, I can show you what I recently got. So I'll move this out of the way. I switched to Harvey not too long ago. So one of the things that happens when you upgrade a miter gauge, a huge feature on them is the ability to adjust the bar to fit the slot in your saw. If you take a standard miter gauge that comes with a table saw and you wiggle it left to right, it probably will wiggle. It'll move a little bit. As a result, it makes accurately cross-cutting or cutting miters with that device difficult because of the slot between the bar and the slot in your table saw. With aftermarket miter gauges, they typically have something, in this case it's these, that allow you to expand or contract a little bit to customize this fit. So in this case, when this pushes through my saw stop, it travels perfectly with no wiggle at all. On this end, it's indexed very, very accurately. What I mean by that is that there are very accurate stops here at various points. So I know that when I go from 0 to 22.5, 0 to 45, it's hitting those spots dead on. I don't have to go to 45 degrees, check it and tweak it. I go to 45 degrees and I make the cut. It's also, compared to a standard miter gauge off your table saw, it's a much longer fence. In addition to that, it's got an extension, so we can go even longer. And then there's also a T-track in the top that will accept a stop. So when you're doing cuts of identical length, we can use a stop on this like you'd use a stop on a miter saw. So that is the Harvey, I'll give you the number. It's the Harvey MG36P, like Paul, miter gauge. And that's been in here for a while. Whoops. That's been in here for a while, forgot to switch cameras. And I like it a lot. Steve says, I have some spalted hackberry I'd like to use for an end table, about 22 inches round. I've never worked with spalted wood before. What should I watch out for? From what I see on the surface, the spalted area seems firm, not soft. So hackberry, if you have not ever seen it, it's an amazing wood. Here's a chunk of it. So that's hackberry. And I've got a huge slab of it over there in my rack, bigger than I want to manhandle over here. So with hackberry, I've made a couple of tables out of hackberry, and working characteristics, I found it very easy to work with. It's not, it's neither super soft nor super hard. I would say it's probably in workability, it's pretty similar to the poplar that I recommend to you folks a lot. Nowhere near as hard as a maple, maybe sneaking up on a walnut, something like that. As far as the spalting goes, there's really nothing to do special there. Spalting, if you're not familiar with it, is a little bit of mold that forms in a chunk of wood. Just seeing if I got a piece. Yeah. It's mold that forms in wood, but once the wood is dry, then the mold is no longer an issue. It's no longer active. So the idea of like, well, I have mold in my wood. Do I need to be careful about that? Once the wood is dry, that spalting, that line right there, is no longer a thing. This is not hackberry. This is Baltic birch. Sorry, this is box elder. This piece, that's the hackberry. But the spalting, those are those black lines. So if a chunk sits in a damp environment for a while, then that's going to start to form. So overall, like I said, machinability is good. I used my typical formula in the table. I did my finishing formula of a base coat of shellac and a top coat of water-based lacquer. It finished fine. It sanded well. It didn't, fuzz or anything like an aspen kind of wood. So again, it machined nicely, finished nicely. Yeah, other than that, it's a pleasant wood to work with, doesn't have a weird smell or anything. And then, of course, on the finishing side, as always, practice on a piece of scrap before you do the real project. Mark says, what's good for filling cracks in walnut slabs? The cracks vary, but are from 5 to 10 inches long, 1/16 to 1/4 inch wide. So there's a bunch of it depends. On cracks the size you're talking about, if it were me, I would probably be pouring epoxy in there. If your end goal is to end up with a surface that's dead flat because it's going to be a table or a writing surface or something, and you don't want those voids in there, then epoxy is a great choice for that, which brings us back to, don't forget, January 9th, Q&A, all about epoxy. You have to pick the right epoxy for it because you're pouring it into a crack that's got some depth to it. If you use the wrong product, it can exotherm, meaning give off a lot of heat, and that can go really badly, really fast. So epoxy is a choice. You could cut over the crack and create some kind of a Dutchman, some kind of an inlay that would cover it completely, so you no longer have the crack there. But one of the benefits to epoxy is you can pour it clear. You could mix a color into it so it becomes an accent that way. You can mix copper flecks into it, brass flecks, so that you give it a little bit more even of an accent than just the color would. So there's a lot of ways to take advantage of that. In walnut in particular, I've done a fair bit of just making the epoxy black and adding it. And that black, simple black, does a nice job of just kind of blending in. Not that it makes it invisible, but it matches the natural look of the walnut. John asks, my bandsaw is not working correctly. Where can I go to have someone work on it? Boy, I have no idea. So I would say there's a bunch of it depends. Working incorrectly, meaning the motor doesn't run, or what's the issue? If it's an electric motor issue, then you would take the motor off and look for a motor repair shop in your area. As far as like getting the whole tool looked at and tuned up, I am not familiar with any services, that work on stationary woodworking tools like that. What you might be able to do is, I think what I would do is check if there's a woodworking club, a woodworking guild in your area, contact them and see if they have suggestions. What that could possibly lead to is somebody from the club willing to come to your shop and look at your bandsaw, which they'd probably charge you for, but that might be a way to make this happen. But as far as like a commercial service that offers tweaking of stationary power tools, I'm not familiar with anything like that. Mike says, on your bandsaw, do you release the tension on the wheels after each use? Daily? How often? This is a great question. Comes up every once in a while. And the only time I've cognitively released the tension on my bandsaw is when I stored my bandsaw, because I was going to go live in Africa for 3 years when I was teaching for the Peace Corps. Now my shop environment is maybe different from yours in that this is my day job. So I am in here all the time. The bandsaw is getting used a few times a week. So as far as taking tension off, just as a normal part of my use, the answer is never. I take the tension off when I change the blade. Other than that, it remains under tension all the time. And I will say, that being said, this is in that first bandsaw was a Delta that I bought in 1994. I didn't replace the tires on that bandsaw until about 2015, 2018. And that wasn't even necessarily that they needed to be replaced. I did it as how-to for a video. So the question of, did leaving the bandsaw under constant tension cause the tires to go bad sooner? No, they lasted whatever that was. The tires were on there 30 years with heavy use, and they weren't cracked, they weren't failing at all. It was just I replaced them to show how to do that for a video. Paul says, I have 2 live edge maple boards. I'm making shelves for my daughter-in-law, staining them with a Minwax dark walnut with pre-stain. What finish would you recommend? I bought 2 spray cans of gloss polyurethane. I can return them if you would recommend something else. I use a rattle can all the time. So again, my go-to finish is a base coat of de-wax shellac, top coat of water-based lacquer, but I'm spraying that through an HVLP gun. When I'm doing smaller scale stuff, I use rattle cans of finish all the time. There's nothing wrong with your polyurethane choice. If it were me, I default to rattle cans of lacquer rather than rattle cans of polyurethane because it dries so much faster. Polyurethane is more protective if there's going to be, wet stuff that gets set on these shelves. But for just normal daily use, lacquer is plenty protective. It dries, flashes so much faster that you can do a lot of coat builds in a really short amount of time. The other thing that is beneficial about that is just that if you're finishing in the same place you're building, part of the problem with slow dry time on polyurethane is that gives more opportunity for just dust falling out of the air to settle on the finish. Because again, that lacquer flashes so quickly, there's less chance for that to happen. So again, it's the polyurethane is not a bad choice, but for me, it would be a spray can of lacquer instead. Mike has 2 oak crosscut sections from an oak tree, each about 5 to 6 inches thick, 15 to 16 inches in diameter. They've been drying about 5 years. I'd like to end up with 4 pieces about 2.5 inches thick for end tabletop. Any suggestions where I might be able to have them sliced and what might be a fair price? So 15-inch diameter isn't huge. You kind of need somebody. You kind of need somebody with a sawmill where you could lay those rounds on a mill and then slice through in order to get your cuts. That's going to keep them. That's going to keep that cut very consistent. Where are you at now? 5 to 6 inches thick. So you got to pretty consistently cut them in half. Yeah, bandsaw mill would be the best way to do that. Fair price, I think. My friend Charlie, who does some contract cutting on his sawmill, I think he's shooting for $125 an hour. So keep in mind with this kind of stuff, I run into this here in my shop all the time. It isn't necessarily that it's going to take an hour and therefore going to cost $125, but also you're disturbing, that person is stopping what they're doing. They're setting up your cuts. they're making your cuts, then they're going back to their day. So even if it took 20 minutes to set up and do, but they want $100, I wouldn't be surprised by that because it's the interruption in their normal workflow. So look in your area for somebody with a bandsaw mill, and then just, it's an easy question to ask, exact same way you posed it here, to find out what they would charge before you go there. The benefit to what you have is that they're easily manageable to take it to them rather than the sawmill have to come to you. William was given a beautiful piece of black and white ebony, about 9 inches by 10 inches by 1 1/4. Any suggestions about what I could make with it that would show off the wood? Something you really like. This is always such a tough question because I could say turn wine bottle stoppers and maybe you don't drink wine. So it's really, what I would do is just pick a category of stuff you like. And this is where the internet can really shine. You can just start searching the internet for images of desktop valets or wine bottle stoppers or cheese slicers or stuff that it's a similar question to somebody saying, I want to make a project, what should I make? And the answer is something that's important to you, which could be way different than what's important to me. So it's so subjective. I would just, like I said, pick a category that you're interested in and just start searching for images, small boxes or stuff. Raphael says, same for us, Christmas Eve. So that's, if you missed when we first opened, I had said, in my family, Czechoslovakian descent, the big Christmas is not Christmas Day, it's Christmas Eve. And it has been that way in my family since forever. Like, if my dad were still alive, he'd be 97. For him as a kid, it was always Christmas Eve, not Christmas Day. Lauren says, is it reasonable to use a 45-degree cutter on a shaper to make a 96-inch long bevel for French cleats, or just do it with a table saw? I would say, so what he's trying to do, it's a very interesting thing that I think we kind of don't think of enough, which is cutting miters with a shaper or a router table. And I have got trying to remember if we did it as a class or a video clip, but it's building a box on which all the miters were made on a 45-degree bit on a router table instead of cutting them on a table saw. It's a crazy cool way to do it. Similar to what you're talking about here, I once built a newel post for a family, and it was going into an older home, mission style, so it needed to be quarter sawn oak and quarter sawn 4 sides. So as a result, it was a column, not a solid post. I did that using a lock miter on a router table. The newel post was only, I don't know, maybe 4 feet long. So not the scale of what you're talking about, 96 inches. I would say, and that's a case where that miter had to be really perfect. The lock miter had to be really perfect for the column to work. For what you're doing for French cleats, I would say it's way easier and faster to just push all those through a table saw, and probably way more practical. And if you set it up, if you think it through and you cut strips that are 3 inches wide, square 2 edges, then you can tilt the table saw blade to 45, make 1 cut, end up with 2 strips. And that's a pretty efficient way to make a lot of French cleat strips. John says, I've learned on the bandsaw, after I'm not planning on using it for a while, I should loosen the tension. However, when I go to tighten my blade, I cannot tighten it anymore, and the blade looks like it needs to be tighter as the blade is still loose. I think my spring is worn out, but I don't know how to replace it. So, yeah, I guess you need to, one way to look at that would be contact the manufacturer, look in your owner's manual, see if there's an exploded view. This is not something, well, I'll take that back. I was going to say not something I've ever done, but it is. Back to that Delta bands I was talking about earlier. For a while, there was a thing about there's a compression spring on the upper wheel, replacing the original manufacturer's spring with a heavier duty spring, which I think the premise was that put more tension, it allowed more tension on the blade. And I know I did that to the Delta saw. This was 30 years ago, so I don't remember exactly what it took, if it was easy or hard. So yeah, I don't know. I would start with owner's manual, exploded view of that component, and then go from there. And you know, just to get a feel for how that looks. Tracy says, just finished a guitar bandsaw box. That sounds cool. Sanded and went to stain it. Box body and back is maple. Front is cherry. Fretboard and drawers are Patagonia rosewood. Used a cherry stain. While unstained, it looked great, but the maple is all splotchy, darker where the end grain is exposed. Planning to finish with lacquer. Is there anything I can do now to clean up the appearance of the maple before final finish? So yeah, this is a thing. Maple and birch, pine, all tend to stain really, really, really blotchy. So to turn the clock back, when you're going to stain a maple or birch or a pine, it's a really good idea to use a preconditioner on those materials in order to mitigate the opportunity for this to happen. So one way to do that is with what is just flat out called conditioner or preconditioner, goes on before the stain. Another way to do this is with de-wax shellac. You put a layer of shellac on, scuff sand it, and then you stain. You're still giving the wood color, but again, you're mitigating that opportunity to get blotchy. I think that the only real approach to make this better now is to sand that, remove as much stain as possible, then go back and use the conditioner and stain again. I would definitely experiment with that on a piece of scrap. So in this case, that experiment would need to be take a leftover piece of maple, don't condition, you know, repeat your conditions that you have now, repeat the circumstances you have now, which would be stain it without conditioner, let it get blotchy, then see what you need to do to that scrap to clean it up so you're not doing anything to the project that takes you in a direction that you don't want to go. But other than removing the stain you have, I don't know what else you could do before clear coating to make the blotchiness look better. Michael says, just got a 1632 drum sander. It's got 80 grit pre-installed. What do you recommend as a default grit and brand to replace it with? Use case is cleaning up resawing and cutting boards in between glue ups. So I've got 80 grit is what's on my drum sander all the time. The difference being I've got a dual drum sander. So it's 80 on the front drum, 120 on the back. So in one pass, I'm getting kind of a rough sand and a finish sand. I would, when I had a Performax 2244, I would say it was 80 grit on that most of the time. When I got close to a finish pass, then I would go to a 120, maybe as high as a 150 to get sanding marks out. Brand, I used to get all of my stuff from Econabrasives. I've heard very good things about Maverick abrasives, and I would buy it by the roll because that's cheaper than, so 1632, you can buy those pieces that are pre-cut. That's the most expensive way to put paper on your drum sander. I would buy it by the roll, cut it myself, and that's much less expensive for papering your sander. And I would get at least an 80 and a 120, maybe an 80, 120, 150. Going to that finer grit is going to save you a lot of time later with a random orbit sander. David says, hi, George. It's always great information. Thank you very much. I tested planing an end grain board today and a planer with a helical cutter head. It worked really well with no kickback or tear out. So the force was with you. Yeah, I get it that it works. It can work. I will never endorse the process because, like I said, if it goes badly, it can go so badly. So Jeremy says, I've been making a chessboard inspired by woodworking with Wes. In the video, he cut down crown molding to make feet. I cut my own molding and only need to trim some of these. How can I safely trim the pieces? I don't know. Because I don't know what your scale is here. I don't have a perspective on when you're talking about trimming the feet. Are they tiny pieces? Are they big pieces? I need to know more about what the problem is you're up against. So it would, if you can give me more details, then that will help me answer your question. John says, what kind of business would I look for to fix my bandsaw? Oh, so we're back to the broken bandsaw. I tried to find a spring for my tensioner knob, but all the spring I found were skinnier maybe than the one on the bandsaw. Yeah, I don't know. That's where I said, I think if you can find a woodworking club in your area, that might be a good place to contact and see if they have any suggestions, or a member of the club willing to come and look at your bandsaw. You could make calls to the manufacturer, see if they have a service depot in your area. You could also, I don't know, that's probably my best bet is woodworking club and specifically the manufacturer of your bandsaw to see if they have any recommendations. Like I said, I'm not familiar with anybody who provides a service of going into somebody else's shop and working on stationary power tools. Joseph says, I drive to the Twin Cities from Madison quite often. Do you have hours open if I wanted to visit? So no, but you're welcome to come by appointment. So this is a great general question for the group. If you want to come see my shop, you're welcome to do so. Go to my website, georgevondriska.com. My phone number is there. You can look up my phone number, call me ahead of time. Do not just drop in because there's a million things happening here and drop-ins do not work for me. So give me a call ahead of time and we can book it, Dano, and find a time that works for both of us. John says the Harvey Compass RG1 and 2 are on sale for $100 off for $179. Still expensive. Do you think it's worth it? Which one do you have? I have the number on this one is MG36P. So where that fits into RG1 and RG2, I don't know. But like I said, I mean, I'm thrilled with this miter gauge. It's been dead on accurate for me. So it was a great addition. Jeffrey says, I've got a DeWalt 735 planer. What's your opinion on switching out the cutter head to a helical? Do you feel it's worth the $500-ish cost? So this is a great question. I had a 735. I had a DeWalt 735 for a long time, and I love that planer. With bench tops in general, I was never thrilled with the disposable knives. Their longevity wasn't great. Surface finish was pretty good, not amazing. As long as they're new and sharp, it was great. So what Jeffrey's talking about here is you can take the head out of not just a DeWalt 735, but many different benchtop planers and replace it with a helical. On the helical, you have carbide inserts instead of steel knives. And on a true helical, they're providing a shear cut. So you have to watch that a little bit. Some companies call it a spiral cutter head, and it's not really. Like, the cutters are positioned in a spiral, but they're not really shearing your material. You want the shear. So the planer I have now is a true helical head, shear cut, carbide insert. The surface finish off of that machine is incredible. And of course, with carbide cutters, they last and they last and they last and they last. So I think the performance improvement is significant. Adding $500 to the DeWalt planer, I like the idea of adding that to a DeWalt 735, because that 735 is a really good planer already. It's got a lot of good attributes. If there's a planer you're choosing to upgrade, I think that's a really good choice. I am happy to spend your money. And you're not going to get into a brand new helical head planer for $500. So, yes, you're adding a lot of money to a $600 planer. But like I said, you're not going to buy a 13-inch helical planer for $500. So I think it's a good upgrade for the DeWalt, for the 735. And we did some work with ShearTech. And I think that's one of the brands you mentioned. And that video is on the website. And in fact, that was me putting a head into a 735. So look up that video, search the site ShearTech or helical or planer. Any of those should get you there. But yeah, I think it's a good upgrade for that DeWalt planer. I'm going to take a second here. We're over halfway through. So a couple things. Again, big thank you to DeWalt, or Titebond. Now I got DeWalt in my head. Big thank you to Titebond for sponsoring us. Again, January 9th, this Q&A, 4 o'clock, January 9th, is specifically going to be about epoxy. I'm not an epoxy expert, but Kristen from Toto Boat is. She is going to be remote, but she's going to be with me for that Q&A. If you have epoxy questions, that is your night to bring them. So mark that on your calendar, watch your email, and you definitely want to tune in for that. I think there's going to be a giveaway of some kind. So you're going to want to watch for how to get involved in that sweepstakes. But again, January 9th is the date, and you want to queue up your epoxy questions for that day. Lots of great questions today. This is great. Anthony says, I found a deal on some construction grade plywood, got 25 sheets, 4x8, stored it under my outdoor lean-to on pallets until I was ready to build shop cabinets. Started a few weeks ago, and finding that when I bring it into the shop and start cutting for carcass components, it's warping. Should I bring it into the heated space and let it acclimate before I use it? Yes, for sure, always. Whether it's man-made stuff or solid wood, you always want to give it plenty of opportunity to acclimate to your indoor space before you start to work with it. How can I take apart a glue joint glued with Titebond 2? I've got a walnut food tray with dovetail joints. The bottom shrunk. I'd like to take it apart and enlarge it before re-gluing. So Type Bond 2 is water resistant, not waterproof. I don't have a bottle here. I don't know. I think this is a case. I think you want to contact Type Bond customer service. I believe that alcohol, like denatured alcohol, will dissolve some glues. I don't know if it'll dissolve Type Bond 2. I don't want to lead you astray here and give you a maybe answer that makes this problem worse. So I would just get a hold of Type Bond customer service and ask them the same question. Gerald says, took your advice, ordered a couple of bandsaw blades from PS Wood. Great service, good price, high quality blades. Good. So those are Timberwolf blades, which I've been using on my bandsaw literally for 30 years, maybe more. And what I like about PS Wood is if you contact them, their expertise is great, and say, this is the bandsaw I have. This is the cutting I want to do. What blade should I get? They will match you up perfectly and make sure your blade selection is matching the task that you want to do. Raphael says, I'm trying my hand at building a rocking horse for my granddaughter. Priced out some hard maple, cherry, and walnut. Found it would cost almost $400 to build. Purchased some maple plywood, decided to go that route. Total cost for that was $82. Wondering if the durability of plywood for a rocking horse will have issues and splintering when she runs her hands on it. So it depends a lot on the core. So something like a multi-ply plywood, what we commonly call Baltic birch, the plies in the core are very, very strong. It doesn't have any inner defects at all. So in something like a cabinet grade maple, the plies are thicker. It's probably a 7-ply plywood in 3/4 inch stock. If it was a multi-ply, it'd be, I think, 19 plies in 3/4 inch stock. So it really is going to depend on the quality of the core. Thinking of like the rockers for the bottom, plywood isn't really made for that kind of wear where you're going to, a kid is going to rock on those rockers. So you might get some premature wear there. If you were asking me about a plywood selection, I would say I would point you toward a multi-ply, a Baltic birch or apple ply, rather than a conventional cabinet grade. I don't know if that would be much cheaper than the solid that you were talking about on the first go round. So yeah, I'd be a little worried about wear on the rockers. As far as everything else goes, I think if you sand the edges, if you do a good job sealing everything, I don't think you'll have a splintering issue. But I think my biggest concern would be wear on the rockers. David says, I'm making a Moxon vise attached to a bench. My plan is about 27 inches wide. Should I keep the vise screws close to the ends or move them to the center to allow me to clamp on the edge of the vise? Well, I don't own a Moxon clamp, but I've seen other woodworkers do them. If we look at this one, this is a Rockler product. So on this one, there's the screw thread is in the center, but then there's a post and a post. And I haven't run into problems as far as that arrangement. You can kind of see placement in the camera there. This one is 21 inches long. This one is 21 inches long, and the posts are about 5.5 inches in from the outside edge. And that arrangement has worked for me very well with what I'm doing. So if that, I'm rereading the question. Yeah, so I think give yourself a little room out here because you're going to want to be able to clamp stuff vertically. But this spacing I just gave you is working out well for me. Harry says, I'm building a table that'll hold a glow forge on a shelf. That's a laser. I was planning to use Baltic birch plywood with maple edge banding. Table will be 46 inches wide and 24 inches deep with a shelf set in dados. Will 1/2-inch plywood with edge banding be rigid enough to hold the glow forge, or do I need to use 3/4 ply or glue 2 sheets together to make a 1-inch shelf? I don't know. So 46 wide, 24 deep. That's a pretty big span. If you're spanning 46 inches, I would be more comfortable doing that in 36-inch material. I'm sorry, 3/4-inch material with your edge band on it. That's going to be very rigid. I don't think, if I was banding everything with maple, I would not be using Baltic birch. I think that is a case where you could use, we're just the opposite of the rocking horse here. You could use a cabinet grade maple plywood for that. That's going to be less expensive than the Baltic. And if you're covering the edges, there's no big reason to use multiply for that. But I would use 3/4-inch stock. And then when you band it, if what you're talking about is like a face frame style edge band where that's 3/4 thick and 2 inches wide, especially if you do that front and back, that's going to really make that shelf rigid and definitely support what you're doing there. Mark says Carter has bandsaw upgrade springs. So back to the fix my bandsaw question. Maybe that's an answer. Is a Carter spring. I'm sure they're model specific. So you could contact Carter at least about getting the spring. As far as installing it, that's a different deal. So Jeremy, I think we're back to the crown molding and cutting those pieces. My pieces are 2 inches, cut 45 to miter together with a rabbet for the chessboard cut already. Some are 2, others aren't. That's why I need to trim them. I'm not sure. I'm still just can't picture. 2-inch must be the width, because if it's a chessboard, right, that's fitting into them, that's got to be, I don't know, whatever, 12 by 12 or bigger. So are you not cutting those miters on a miter saw then? I don't know. I'm not visualizing this. Does not Wes or whoever you got them from have a plan for how you would do this? So that would be, I'm not trying to dodge this here, but I would contact the person who made the plan and ask them, because they're obviously familiar with it. I can't visualize what it is you're trying to do. It sounds like you're mitering 2-inch by something pieces of crown molding to put together a frame into which you're going to set a chessboard, which sounds like a miter saw thing. Harry just clarified, and I get it now. RG1 and RG2 are the feather boards. That's this. These are a lovely thing. So I have got the RG2. So the deal with this is it goes into your miter gauge slot, locks in with these. These rollers are unidirectional, one directional. So they'll feed this way, they won't backfeed. So they help, I hate to say eliminate, reduce the likelihood of kickback. The thing that's really cool about this is you position it with these against your work. So of course, this component is in the miter gauge slot. And this dial, the intention of this dial, when I turn this, it's advancing or retracting those rollers. So you can get this close, and then by turning that dial, you can increase or decrease pressure on whatever you're doing. I use this resawing on my bandsaw all the time. This is a really good device for the bandsaw. And then same, you could set that up as a feather board on your table saw to hold your material against your table saw fence. So yeah, I love those things. It's a really good product. For the Maxon Vice question, oh, there are really great plans at Taylor Tools with an excellent set of free plans for downloading. Got it. All right. So we're sneaking up on 5 o'clock. So again, I'm going to say January 9th is the epoxy special. We're going to have an expert here who has forgotten more about epoxy than I will ever know. And I love this because epoxy is expensive. There are a lot of variables that can come up when you're working with it. People ask Paul and I questions all the time about working with epoxy. I have heard so many horror stories about epoxy going wrong. And then are you sanding all that off the project? Or, how do you fix that? So get ahead of that epoxy curve by getting back here, 4 o'clock Central Time, January 9th. Watch your email for notifications about this. I've said a couple of times, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a drawing probably in the epoxy world. So you might have an opportunity to win some cool stuff. So watch your email. Watch for that epoxy special with Kristen from Total Boat. And I think we are set on questions. Other than that, Santa Claus is coming to town. So have yourself a great Christmas, if that's your thing, in a couple of weeks. Have yourself a great holiday season, no matter what. I will not see you again until after the new year. So happy New Year, and I'll see you when we do this next.